Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the French Revolution in our continuing study of world civilizations. France, at the beginning of the revolution, of course, had a king. They'd had a king for a very long time, but there were three estates that were under the king. First of all was the first estate, that was made up of the clergy. Secondly was the second estate, the nobility, and finally the third estate was made up of everybody else. Now, typically, the first estate and the second estate would sort of band together and agree on everything, and the third estate was always left out in the cold, and the king basically got what he wanted through the nobility and the clergy, this sort of team up. But that's all going to change as the first estate sees that they're actually being overlooked by the nobility. The nobility was doing whatever they wanted, and so they thought, well, perhaps we can get more influence if we will band with a third estate. It came to a head when they sought a meeting and somebody had unintentionally, I'm supposing, locked the doors to the meeting place. So rather than go home and say that's it, they went across the street to a indoor tennis court, and there the first estate and the third estate, the representatives thereof, actually took what was known as the tennis court oath. They said, we are going to band together and until we get some significant changes in the government. Now, later that same year, that was 1789, that same year, not those estates, and actually they had begun meeting and they had been putting together a constitution, but while all that is happening, the mob riots and they stormed the Bastille. The Bastille was the official political prison of France. It was something they looked upon with great fear and great dread. And if we can only overcome the Bastille, and they did, to release all the political prisoners. Actually, when they got there, it was mostly empty, much to their surprise, because there weren't a lot of reports as to who'd been in and who had not been in. But that remains to be a very symbolic gesture. Subsequently to this, they come out with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It sounds in many respects like it reminds us of the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson had penned, and it certainly is influenced by him. Much of the language is the same. It speaks about how men are born and remain with free and equal in rights. And you can hear Jefferson's words, his ideas, reflected in this. But it did not address some issues, just like the Declaration of Independence did not address the issue of slavery in the Americas. Likewise, this did not address people under 25 years of age or the unemployed who still had to pay taxes. Well, where are you going to get the money from? Sometimes they would find themselves being indentured for such things. It did not address foreigners. It did not address women. And of course, that same old issue of slavery was still there. It did not address slavery. The French Revolution then has broken out. The King Louis XVI was caught fleeing down to the south, and he was returned to France. And just like we had seen back in England in the previous century, when King Charles had been put to death. Now Louis hadn't been at war with them; he had actually been trying his best to. He didn't want to go over to other countries. Because that would be very un-French, but he also had been trying to let this new government form, and to leave and to escape, and he was captured, and he's going to be executed. Banks during this time were failing. Now, there had been a financial crisis going back to that 7 Years' War, the same war that had led to a financial crisis in England and the whole taxation without representation in the American colonies. This was also seen its counterpart in France. Church property was now was now confiscated. Monasteries were shut down, and now those lands taken over. You'd think they were going to be taken over by the poor people. Well, they weren't, but they were taken over by others. The clergy was dismissed. Some of the clergy would eventually become employees of the state, and we're going to see where that leads in a bit. The clergy are going to be elected by the people, so if the local pastor or priest, they didn't really have pastors, priest, bishop, whatever, is popular among the people, he may get elected and put back into something like his old position. But if not, then he's going to be out. There will be no papal confirmation because the Pope is not in agreement with any of this. He's completely against this change of government. Marriage is no longer going to be a church sacrament, which means that the laws regarding marriage and divorce and remarriage, those are all out the window. That's all going to be come to new conclusions with the new government. So you'd had what they call now the constitutional clergy. They're required to swear an oath of loyalty to the state. And those who do not do that, those who refuse to swear that oath of loyalty, they're going to be dismissed. They are known as the refractory clergy. And so they're going to be out. The constitutional clergy, if they are elected by the people, they will be allowed to remain, at least for the time being. The others are taken out of the way. But now they are also required to swear an oath of hatred to the king or even the idea of a king, and those who do not are declared to be an enemy of the state, and they're put to death. And so the clergy now in France is coming under very harsh times as France is now moving to become a secular country. And so those who remain now are those who swear an oath of hatred to the king, loyalty to the state. The state is everything. Remember how Louis XIV had said, the state, it is I. Now the state is saying, no, the state, we are the state. This now leads to a reign, what's called the Reign of Terror, as everybody is now becoming suspect. We have mobs going through the street. Anyone who the mob doesn't like, they're taken, they're beheaded. The guillotine, of course, the guillotine was thought of as a modern invention, a painless way of putting people to death. After all, the blade comes down and whacks out their head, and after that, they don't feel anything. But this reign of terror now it becomes responsible for the death of thousands. Christianity now is officially abolished. We have a new religion established by the French Constitution, and it will be called the Cult of the Supreme Being. They still have these churches, and so what do you do when you go to the church? You go and somebody gets up and talks. He might make reference to the Supreme Being, and now how we have the state, and it's really going to be sermons about the state and how everybody has to be on board with this, and that's the right and proper thing to do. Monasteries are nationalized. Marriage and divorce, as I said, goes through a huge upheaval. The calendar is going to be changed. Now that's not going to last, but they say we're going to make year one not beginning with the birth of Christ, but we're going to make year one beginning with the French Revolution. We're going to start the calendar again. And we're going to have different days of the week. We don't like what we had before, that whole idea of having a Sabbath, Saturday or Sunday. We're doing away with that. We'll have special days for the state instead. And as I said before, this is now going to be year one. Now, England, going all the way back to the days of Magna Carta, had been a country that saw itself where there was law, which was over the will of the king. That had led to Magna Carta, that had led to the execution of Charles I. Even though England still had kings, the law was over the will of the king. But now in France, and remember in France with Louis XIV, we'd seen the will of king was over the law. Louis XIV had said, the state, it is I. Well, in England, when they got rid of the king, They didn't get rid of the king. They actually still have a monarch, but it was no longer the king who was exercising his kingly authority, and the authority of the king is going to go downhill. They still have a monarchy in England today, but it's Parliament that's making all the decisions. But notice, law is still over the will of the people. At least that's the idea behind that. Whereas in France, when we had the will of the king over the law, but now we're going to get rid of the king, we'll have the will of the people, which will now be seen as over the law. So it doesn't matter what the law says. Whatever you can get the people who are running things to decide, they get to choose what is appropriate and what will take place. So the rule of law will not be the rule in France. And that brings us to a contrast in the French versus the American, and when I say American, I'm talking about the North American, specifically the American colonies, what will eventually be the United States, the revolution there. Although we're going to see other American revolutions, that is, revolutions in the rest of the Americas. Well, the French Revolution was violent in character. The American Revolution did lead to a war, but it sought to have a peaceful separation. In France, of course, that took place in 1789. American Revolution, we usually think 1776, although the fighting actually began a year earlier. So that one led perhaps to the other, at least that was the common thinking of that day. The French Revolution was brought about largely by a financial crisis of national debt. Of course, that had been an issue. There had been taxation without representation in the Americas, so there's a sense in which, in both cases, you can follow the money. With the American Revolution, we have the Declaration of Independence. With the French Revolution, a Declaration of the Rights of Man. So in both cases, you have a document being drawn up that will describe what is taking place. In the French Revolution, rights are subject to public order and public necessity, and I use those terms in quotes. Notice rights are sort of up for grabs. In the American Revolution, we're eventually going to see in the Americas a Bill of Rights, which are supposed to be inviolable. A very big difference between the two. With the French Revolution, we're going to see them confiscating church property. With the American Revolution, there's a respect for religion. Yes, in some cases there will cease to be a state religion, although some states will continue even having that, state denominations. But there's going to be a high degree of respect for religion, and that's going to result in a democratic republic in the United States. In France, it will come to that eventually, but initially it will result in a military dictatorship in the person of Napoleon Bonaparte.